Hi, so my name is Ridge Weston. I'm here with David Carter, and he runs the University of Michigan Video Game Archive. And I'm just going to ask him a couple of questions on how he feels about the statement, do violent video games cause children to be more violent later on in life? So, I guess the first question, where did you go to school, and what's your profession, and just kind of tell us a little bit about what you do.
Oh, okay. Well, that'll take up a lot of our time. So school.
Oh, and I'm doing fine on time. I have like a half an hour, 45 minutes, so we'll be okay.
Right, I've got until quarter to two.
Quarter to? Okay, cool. Sounds good.
So what school? Like high school?
Like
grade?
whatever you got. Essentially, what I'm doing is I'm actually going to do a podcast.
Okay.
Of like my own kind of lit review, and then I'm going to cut in segments of this interview.
Okay.
So whatever information you can give me is, even if it's not like relevant, I can still just pick and choose what's cut in. And I'm not going to like misrepresent you or anything. I'm just going to cut it in to make it all kind of fit. So.
So I did my undergrad here in engineering, and I got my master's here in library science. And
Nice.
So I'm a librarian here. I'm the video game archivist, the comics librarian, and one of the reference services coordinators for the university library.
Cool. Sounds good. So, question number 2, the big one. Do you think that kids who play violent video games will become more violent later on in life as a result of those video games? And what evidence and or personal experience do you have to support your claim?
Right. So I don't know. Nobody knows. The research on this topic is not good.
Okay.
There's some research on this topic, but none of which that I've seen that to answer a question like that, which is really what people want to know.
Sure.
Actually measures that.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen studies that are more or less sound that say that children who play or people who play violent video games immediately after playing those games are more aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
But aggressive is not the same as violent. And there's been no studies showing, no legitimate studies showing that there's any long-term effects on that. That doesn't mean that there isn't long-term effects on that. That
Mm-hmm.
just means that nobody has shown, one way or the other, that there's any sort of long-term effects from playing a violent video game for that. So being the sort of person who likes to follow evidence, all I can say is that there's no proof one way or the other on that.
Mm-hmm.
My personal feelings on that are that for most people that would not be a trigger to a long-term violent sort of thing. Would it be possible that some people may be triggered to that? Perhaps. Would they have been triggered by something else to become violent in their adult life? Perhaps. These are really, really complex things that are very, very hard to measure.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like testing some question in physics. Did it happen or didn't it happen? You're dealing with people and populations and longitudinal studies and all that sort of thing. So just nobody's done the research on it, so you can't really say one way or the other. Which means you got a lot of people going off of anecdotes and other sorts of things and making policy based on gut feelings.
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps faulty reasoning, as opposed to basing it on evidence and research. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know, and nobody knows, and anybody who tells you otherwise is lying.
Okay.
Well, lying's too strong a word. Is perhaps misguided.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for that. So question 3, right now, obviously, there's the stigma that, some people think that violent video games cause kids to be more violent. But personally, I haven't seen that large of a stigma against, say, something in sports like football or boxing, which are obviously violent sports. So why do you think that there's a stigma, or at least my perception is that there's a larger stigma against violent video games, but not necessarily against things like sports? Why do you think that is?
Video games are newish. They've been around. They've been around for 40 some years, 50, long time.
Mm-hmm.
But they're still perceived as new. They're different. When you play a sport, it's a physical activity, right? And so you are. I'm using air quotes here, which you can't see in the recording.
Yeah.
Getting out your aggression, right, in a controlled sort of way, usually. Especially for organized sports. You're out there on the football field, and there are referees and there are rules, and most people tend to follow those. Even boxing, which is people hitting each other, there are rules and stuff that you're on, and so that allows the participants in it to experience aggression in a controlled manner. The participants then can get on their bloodlust or whatever you want to say by watching two people pound each other. And that sort of thing, but it's all controlled, and we all realize that it's controlled. And so I think the fear amongst video games are that there's a fear that it's hitting these violent centers in people's psyches or whatever, and that building people to become immune to violence. And it's just enough like the real world that are just, and I've heard about, and I don't know how true these things are about, like military using violent simulations in order to numb their soldiers to the fact that they're committing violence when they're out there shooting people. But we've had soldiers for millennia.
Sure.
We've only had video games for a few decades. So I'm not sure how, we would still have armies and wars and stuff like that without video games existing. But is there perhaps something to the fact that a pilot operating a drone remotely and carrying out a bombing raid halfway across the world, and he's just seeing it on a little screen? That's a lot like a video game, and so perhaps it creates enough of a distance on there. That somebody can do that as opposed to being out there in person doing that. Again, I don't know, but I can see that argument, and I can see that argument having some sort of validity. I'd be interested in seeing somebody actually study that. That's probably nothing that the Army is ready to have. or if they are, they're not going to
probably not going to give out that information just yet,
right? But I think it's the newness of video games. The video games today are different from the video games when I was a kid. When I was a kid, we had little squares hitting little other squares, and we pretend. You're probably too young to remember Mortal Kombat.
I own Mortal Kombat. Okay. I don't know what you're talking about.
You don't remember what it was like when it first came out, and this was like extremely violent video game, and it was going to be the end of civilization because it was so violent, right? We had a class in a few years ago in the CVGA that they were studying violent video games in the class, or they had one of their class sessions about violent video games, and so the professor wanted to bring the students into the CVGA and have them play violent video games. Among the things that happened in there is a couple of students asked to play Mortal Kombat because they'd heard about, this is such a violent game, and they'd talked about it in class or whatever, and they played it, and they're like, what is all the fuss about? It's little, it doesn't even look realistic. It's, we've played much more violent things. And they were not horrified by the level of violence in Mortal Kombat the way that people were, was it 20 years ago or so when it first came out? So what does that mean going forward when we're getting to VR games and everything like that, when games are becoming more realistic and more visceral to people? Perhaps. Again, nobody knows. Anybody who tells you doesn't really know what's going on there.
So my next question was, like, you have indicated blank, and I was going to fit that into what you said, and I think it's funny how you indicated that nobody really knows what's going on. So you indicated that nobody knows what's really going on. So what do you think is the best way moving forward to gathering more information, or do you think it's even necessary to fund projects to figure out if violent video games cause people to be more violent? Essentially, just what's the best thing to do moving forward?
Right. So, yes, more research would be good.
Sure.
A lot of what I've seen are people who want to do that sort of research have an agenda going into it. They either want to show that violent video games cause people to be violent, or they want to show the opposite, that violent video games don't cause people to be opposite. I think that colors the sort of study that they put together, which is why I say there are lots of studies on this, but I don't find many of them to be terribly persuasive, because I don't think that they were put together very well on that. So, it'd be great if, like, the NIH was able to fund an initiative, or they funded multiple sorts of projects on this, and so we could get a look at it. And like I said, they almost have to be these longitudinal studies, which are really hard to do and expensive to do. NIH has done longitudinal studies in the past. So that could be done, but then we're not going to know for 10, 15 years what the results are. We might get some preliminary.
And who knows what video games will be like in 10 or 15 years from now, because it's moved so quickly.
Right. I mean, so you're going to have a cadre of kids. You're experimenting on kids. That's not. Raises all sorts of ethical questions right there. Have a control group that doesn't play violent video games, another group that does, and then follow them through the next 10, 15, 20 years of their lives and see what happens. Do a greater percentage than normal become violent criminals or become involved in violent activities, however you want to phrase that. So you're going to need a large pool of kids to experiment on, which people tend to frown on doing that sort of thing, especially since it's like, we're going to see if they become violent, right? Because that's not really experiment that anyone wants to do. So I think it's going to be very hard to actually get an answer to this question, which is kind of too bad, because we're left with, like I said, anecdotes and people thinking about stuff. And so is it worthwhile? Yes. Do I see it as something that's reasonably going to happen? No.
Cool. So I have one last question for you. My final question is, why did you decide to make your professional work email superman@umich.edu?
So I got that back in 1989 when I was a freshman in engineering, and we needed to get a Kane account, and so I went to the Kane office, and they sat me down in front of a computer and said, "Pick a login and a password." I said, "What's that?"
What's the Kane office, really fast?
Kane is the Computer-Aided Engineering Network. They do IT support for the College of Engineering, and so they said, pick something you'll remember, 8 characters or less. So I picked Superman as my login because that's something I would remember. And because I've stayed at the university for 30 years, that's just followed me throughout the whole thing. So it wasn't a conscious decision, but it's worked out fine.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
That's all I have.
Yep. Know about the Issues and Controversies database?
I do not.
All right. So
also, I'm recording again, just to let you know.
So the library subscribes to this database called Issues and Controversies, which if you go to the library search and database, I searched on current issues and it came up, Issues and Controversies. So it's a database of basically sorry, I got involved in here. So different any sort of thing that's your find pro-con thing. It's very much geared towards like undergraduates and things like that. So you just find stuff, child abuse or adoption or birth control or criminal justice system, cybercrime, cigarette tax, any sort of thing you can think of. So if you search for video games, it brings up several topics. They have video games, Gamergate, violent video games, etc. So there's should the government pass laws restricting children's access to violent video games? And so usually they'll have an article, sort of a pro-con article, which sort of lays out the pros and cons of the issue. Then, primary sources and media and infographics and editorials and news and that sort of stuff. So you might want to look through that for this is sort of secondary material for that. Okay. Primary material, you probably want to search in like psychology, PsycInfo. Have you used that?
I have not.
Okay. PsycInfo is the main psychology research database,
Okay.
and there's Sociological Abstract, I think, is a social science one, and then probably also the medical literature. So, PubMed is a good one to search in there as well. And basically, you can just do a search on violent video games, and I'm sure you're going to come up with tons and tons of stuff. So that's going to lead you to primary sources, like a lot of the studies that I was alluding to and things like that.
Gotcha. I know, like, I'm working in a lab right now for the first time, and the first thing I had to do was a lit review, so they kind of taught me how to use, like, Google Scholar a little bit.
Okay.
So I did quickly just kind of look through Google Scholar, but for the most part, I really didn't look at many of the articles. I wanted to interview you before I did any of that kind of stuff, so...
Yeah, I tend
all I did.
I tend to shy people away from Google Scholar as the first place to go.
Okay, why is that?
Google's idea on what is scholarly is not necessarily matched up with with our idea on what's scholarly. So you'll find some questionable sources in Google Scholar, and I think you'll get better results by going to a subject-specific database like PsycInfo or Sociological Abstracts and doing your search in there. So if we go to where were we? Sociological Abstracts. Yeah. So go to there. Video games. Let's see. Let's do and violence. Oops, I didn't spell violence right. There we go. So link between competitive video games, competitive gambling, and aggression. Huh, who knew? Relations between video game violence and aggression. That was the one done here.
Okay.
So it was done a few years ago. Video games and youth violence, perspective and analysis in adolescence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
okay. I didn't know there was one done here. I'll probably reference that in my video.
Yeah, and you might even reach out to the person who did it and see if... Anyway.
Okay. And would you say the name of this was? I'm sure I have it in the recording, but
is this the one I'm thinking of? Hang on, I might be being led astray here. Somebody at ProQuest. Huh. That's just weird. No, it's published by ProQuest. This is not the one I'm thinking of.
Okay.
There was one. There was some faculty here who did a study on video games and aggression. And if I think about it, I'll see if I can hunt that up and send and email it to you.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that very much.
Yeah. All right.
That's everything.
Okay.